Wait, how does this work?
You just press the button.
This one?
No, not that one.
You're listening to Press the Button, a Ploughshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security.
Everything seems impossible till it happens.
Everyone would be affected by a nuclear war.
Our government is planning to spend trillions of dollars to develop new nuclear weapons that we don't need.
You can't win a nuclear war.
We are all experts on nuclear weapons because we are all going to be affected by those nuclear weapons.
And here's your host, Joe Cirincione.
Thank you, Dell. There's a lot happening this week. Are we on the brink of war with Iran? Are we on the brink of a new summit with North Korea? We're going to go over both of these with Catherine Killough and Mary Kaszynski in our early warning segment. What we feature this week is an unbelievable interview with Dan Ellsberg. Everybody knows that Dan stole a lot of government documents, the Pentagon Papers. What most people don't know is that in addition to this historic trove of documents on the Vietnam War, he copied an equal number of documents on U.S. nuclear policy. We're going to talk about what he found out, what his experiences were as a nuclear war planner in the early 1960s, and why he decided to finally reveal this information in his new book, The Doomsday Machine. But first, the news.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
I'm here at the Ploughshares Fund Washington, D.C. headquarters on a muggy June day, but a clear view of the Washington Monument from our glass-enclosed headquarters. I'm here with Mary Kaszynski, our Deputy Policy Director, and Catherine Killough, our North Korea expert, and Roger Hale Fellow. We got a lot to cover, so let's get right to it. The clock is ticking. Mary, we are closer to war with Iran now than we've been at any time since the crises of 2010, 2011. But fill us in. Where are we? How close are we? What do you think is going to be happening?
Well, we really are on the brink of a crisis with Iran, and it's a crisis created entirely by Trump. So taking a step back, this crisis started when Trump violated the Iran nuclear agreement over a year ago. And as you all know, the basic bargain of the nuclear agreement was that Iran rolled back its nuclear program, verified by international inspectors, and in exchange, the U.S. provided some sanctions relief. What Trump did was a complete and total violation of that agreement. He reimposed all nuclear sanctions and then some. Since that year, the administration has been piling new sanctions on Iran, who has remained in compliance with the agreement. So I think it's really important to remember that that total and complete violation by the U.S. is entirely different from some of the steps that Iran is considering taking now.
But would those steps put Iran in violation of the deal, too?
Absolutely, and it's certainly regrettable that Iran has announced that it will begin to take some steps to move away from the limits of the Iran nuclear agreement. However, those steps are very minor and reversible, especially in comparison to what the U.S. has done. Now, the steps that Iran has said that it's going to begin taking this week include breaching the low-enriched uranium stockpile limits. Again, this is a very minor step. There's not a whole lot you can do with 400 kilograms of low-enriched uranium.
Right. The deal required them to export 97% of their stockpile. They were left with 300 kilograms. They might slightly exceed that.
Exactly. So again, it's a minor step. It is a breach of the nuclear agreement, but it's not a very dangerous one.
Yeah, but might the administration take advantage of that anyway? You know, they can spin anything any way they want. What are Trump and Bolton up to?
Absolutely. Well, so Bolton is on a tour of the Middle East this week, Bolton and Secretary of State Pompeo, ostensibly to unroll the Middle East peace plan. But in fact, this looks very much like Bolton and Pompeo pushing their drive for military action against Iran, as they've been doing pretty consistently.
Bolton's in Israel, Pompeo's in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. This is certainly the anti-Iran axis.
Exactly. Well, and today President Trump announced that he's going to unroll new sanctions against Iran. So again, the U.S. continues to ramp up its aggression toward Iran, and it remains to be seen how Iran will respond, but there will certainly be another crisis moment, possibly very soon.
Is there anything Congress can do to rein him in?
Absolutely. It's essential that Congress make it clear that the president does not have authorization for military force against Iran. Pompeo and Bolton claim that they do. That's just not correct. But Congress really needs to step up and cut off funds for an unauthorized strike against Iran.
And any action on that front?
This week we'll perhaps see some action. The Senate is poised to consider the National Defense Authorization Act. It could pass the Senate this week. Senators Udall and Kaine have an amendment that would cut off funds for unauthorized use of force against Iran. There could be a big debate on this in the Senate this week.
And who are the champions in the House?
In the House, Representatives Khanna and Brown are working on an amendment that was introduced in the House Armed Services Committee a few weeks ago that would do the same thing. It would cut off funding for unauthorized military strikes against Iran. That will probably be on the House floor sometime in July.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Meanwhile, Catherine, a flurry of activity suddenly on North Korea. President Xi of China pays his first ever visit to the North Korean capital. There's been an exchange of letters between Trump and Kim, more beautiful letters. And now Trump announces he's going to meet with South Korean President Moon in South Korea next week. What does all this mean?
Right. Well, I think the uptick in diplomatic activity just in the last week really shows that every relevant player still really wants this process to keep going and to see some kind of outcome, some tangible outcome from it. I think the challenge is still trying to find that sweet spot where everyone's different maximalist positions overlap. And I think being ever the optimist, we are actually getting closer to that point, thanks even to the failures of Hanoi. I think we have seen enough time pass for North Korea to reassess their negotiating position, and given the positive reception of Trump's letter to Kim, they seem to be very open to another possible meeting.
Wait, another summit might be possible even after the humiliation of Hanoi?
I think so. I mean, that's the question, right? Is will there be a third summit? And considering all the past letter exchanges between North Korea and the U.S., we have tended to see major meetings between administration officials or even the leaders themselves after these exchanges.
So the President Xi's meeting with Kim in North Korea help or hurt the prospects for negotiations?
I personally think that they'll help. There's a tendency to read China's involvement in the denuclearization talks as China trying to reassert themselves between the U.S. and North Korea. But I think a more interesting read is from the domestic angle. And that is, if you can imagine that there are factions within the North Korean regime where there is this internal debate on the merits of economic reform and this diplomatic outreach that we've seen from Kim, then having a state leader like Xi Jinping actually visit North Korea and give a ringing endorsement to Kim Jong-un, that's a huge boost to the reformist position.
Right. I saw our colleague Bob Carlin was writing about this in 38 North. Excellent. And I'm afraid that we are out of time. That was 7 minutes of news, and that is all the time the president would have if he was warned, correctly or incorrectly, about a nuclear attack in the United States before he had to decide whether he was going to press the button. That gives you some idea of how insane our nuclear command and control system is. Thank you very much, Catherine, for joining us. Thank you, Mary. I wish we had more time. We don't. I am delighted to be in the home of Dan and Patricia Ellsberg here in Kensington, right outside Berkeley Hills, looking out over the bay, barely see the Golden Gate Bridge in the background on a foggy June 13th morning. And Dan, this is the the 50th anniversary of the publication of the Pentagon Papers. So thank you for welcoming us into your home on this propitious anniversary.
Thank you. I always enjoy talking with you about nuclear issues as much as one can enjoy talking about nuclear issues, Joe.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. And it's a perfect starting off point because most people don't realize that in addition to the Pentagon Papers, you also had a number of, an equal number of nuclear-related documents that disclose the nuclear history of the United States that you had intended to release as well, and that you had been, before a Vietnam analyst, a nuclear analyst. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
I started in defense issues coming from Harvard in 1958 as a summer consultant to the Rand Corporation, working on that summer what we thought was the most urgent problem in the world, and that was how to deter a Soviet surprise attack with the missiles which we thought they had, many times what the U.S. was planning to have, as a matter of fact, and in the Air Force, and we were working for the Air Force on contract. The Air Force intelligence was projecting thousands of missiles within a few years, and perhaps 300 within a year or two. The reality turned out to be, by the way, that in 1961, they had 4. At a time, a month after the commander of Strategic Air Command, Thomas Power, had estimated when I was at his headquarters in Offutt, Omaha.
Right, there was no missile gap.
He had said there was 1,000, that the Soviets had 1,000, we had 40. Well, we had 40, they had 4. So he was off by 250 times. But that was the problem I'd been working on. And in particular, I'd specialized in the problem of under what conditions might our weapons be launched without authority from the president or from a higher command. I discovered in the Pacific, working for Commander-in-Chief Pacific, Harry D. Felt, for a year or so, that there were many occasions, under many circumstances, under which lower officers who had control of nuclear weapons might well feel not only that it was time to use those, but that they had authorization to do it. President Eisenhower had, in fact, delegated that authority, if communications were out with Washington, to Admiral Felt in Oahu. He, in turn, had delegated it to lower commanders, and that went way down, it turned out. So the chance that this whole apparatus of deterrence would be launched on a mistaken false alarm of a kind that actually then had occurred and has occurred frequently since, might actually bring about World War III on a false alarm.
A large part of the story you tell in the book, and that I think the American public still doesn't understand, and so both of your books are very helpful in that regard, is the scale of the nuclear attacks that we had planned, and what they would have meant if we had ever executed these plans, what they actually would have meant.
Exactly. I don't think there are very many Americans, even in the government, that have ever understood fully the scope of what we were planning. And indeed, when I fully learned that, it affected my sense of the human species, of our species, because I didn't think I was learning just about Americans. I couldn't believe that. I'll tell you what I'm talking about. I drafted a question initially for the Secretary of Defense, McNamara, Robert McNamara, in 1961, to send to the Joint Chiefs, along with many other pages of questions that I had written for him, and which he did send. This particular question was picked up by the deputy to the National Security Assistant, who was McGeorge Bundy, picked up by Robert Comer, his deputy, and sent to the Joint Chiefs in the name of the President. And that one question was, if your plans are carried out as planned, if they hit the targets that are intended, how many will die in the USSR and China? Unlike all the other questions that I asked through McNamara, which were stalled and eventually never answered, this one was answered within a week, with no apology or embarrassment. It was in the form of a graph showing how many millions would be killed immediately, by fire and blast and prompt radiation. The figure was 275 million people. That slanted up to 50 million to 325 million people in the Soviets and China alone. without any retaliation by them and without figuring what the fallout would do in other parts of Europe. So I asked that question in the name of the president, and again got an answer back within a week, this time in the form of a table with columns for different countries. And the upshot of that was that our plans would kill another 100 million in East Europe, the so-called satellites, the slave countries, the occupied countries. We would kill 100 million of those, Poles, Romanians, Hungarians.
From the radiation.
And from the radiation, but also from direct attacks, supposedly not on their cities, but on their airfields, which are next to cities.
Yes.
And their radars, their air defenses, and so forth. So it would hit their cities without nominally targeting them. In West Europe, of course, not a single American warhead would land in the land of our NATO allies in West Europe. But 100 million of them would be killed by the fallout from the east, depending to some extent on the wind, which depended on the season to some extent when this occurred. So that's 200 million more. And another third, 100 million, would be killed in areas contiguous to the Soviet Union and China, neutral countries like Afghanistan, Finland, Austria, and in China, Japan and India, for a total of 600 million people, or 100 Holocausts, as I saw it. And this is a plan by Americans, colonels and generals that I worked with every day in the Pentagon, drank beer with at night, very ordinary people, had made this plan, and we're perfecting it and carrying it forward. But that wouldn't have been the extent of the actual damage. There were 3 billion people in the world at that time, 1961. These plans did not take account of fire, which is the biggest effect of thermonuclear weapons. Why not? Because it was hard to calculate. It depended on the weather, on the kindling, on a number of factors, the density of population. That would have brought the figure up to 1 billion. But it was another 22 years in 1983 when Russian and American scientists like Carl Sagan and Richard Turco and a few others, about 11, revealed their calculations that soot from the burning cities, which would be caused by these attacks on either side would burn hundreds of cities, even without nominally targeting them by hitting military targets near the cities. That is still true. That each of us, in other words, has on alert more than enough weapons to cause nuclear winter, which would cause the starvation of nearly all humans, perhaps 98% or more.
Yes. And you talk in the Doomsday Machine, in the book, about what this means, that even though we've talked about a policy of deterrence, that is, that nuclear weapons exist in order to deter other people from attacking us with nuclear weapons, but in order for that deterrence to be real, to be believed, we have to be prepared to do it, to launch these attacks. And your argument is that if we do this, if we launch an attack, it's not mutually assured deterrence, it's self-assured destruction, or SAD.
That's true. The word deterrence and the concept of it, which has some substance, we can get back to that, doesn't at all rationalize what we have, which is the ability to destroy life on Earth with our own attacks, and the Russians can do it too. To deter attack, China, for example, with less than 300 weapons ever, compared to the 70,000 that the U.S. and Russia had between them. China, great power, has never had more than 300 and has very strong deterrence, as a matter of fact.
Yes.
So these other weapons clearly are neither required for deterrence, nor do they have anything to do with deterrence.
China has about 300 total. I think the
total,
figures are
including
actually
tactical
left.
weapons.
There are somewhere between 40 and 60 that can reach us on their long-range missiles, and that is plenty to deter us. The idea that we would attack China knowing that they could destroy 1, 2, 30, 40 cities is plenty, and yet we have an arsenal that is about 4,000 nuclear weapons
in other words,
in our
the goal of
active
deterrence
stockpile.
is used to explain a buildup that has nothing to do with deterrence, and which in fact lowers it, literally does lower deterrence, because it constitutes a first strike threat, as I said Eisenhower had in mind, going back, and it's always been true, getting in the first strike, supposedly limiting damage to the United States from what the other side can launch, because you've destroyed his ICBMs, let's say, so he doesn't have them to attack you with. Will that lower damage, as we're still attempting to do by building these weapons and making great profits for Boeing, Lockheed, and a few other firms, and counterpart firms in Russia? Would they have the benefit of lowering damage in a war between us? Not in the slightest. The submarine weapons, which these weapons cannot target or destroy on each side, on alert, are far more than enough, again, to cause nuclear winter on either side. Both sides are poised with their ICBMs on 10-minute warning to respond to satellite or radar warning of a kind that has come through. Yes. It's on 1979, 1980 on our side, 1983 on the Russian side, 1995 on the Russian side, confronting the high-level officials with the question, is this the time to launch our nuclear force? The reality is, there is never a time to do that. To do that is, we've built the capability to do it, we threaten it, we ready it, we alert. There is never a time when it would be other than evil, because to launch that force, even if you knew the other force was coming in, because your own force, like theirs, would destroy nearly all life on Earth of humans. Other animals will not be that lucky. They'll be made entirely extinct.
You know, Ronald Reagan wrote that he wasn't sure he could ever press the button. Even if we were under attack and we were launching in retaliation, he felt, well, what's the point? Deterrence has already failed. What could he morally justify in any way killing hundreds of millions of civilians on the other side who had nothing to do?
He would have no trouble justifying it, because all of his predecessors, Democrat and Republican, have prepared themselves to do that, have rehearsed it, planned for it, prepared it. His military will be telling him this is the time for us to carry out the functions we've been training for and buying weapons for. Everybody will be telling him he should do it, just as, by the way, a colonel in Russia was hearing in 1983 that he should tell his superiors that they were under attack at that moment. And he held back. Stanislav Petrov held back and said, no, it's a false alarm, when he wasn't sure that it was.
Yes.
But it was. And that's why we're here today, because of that one man. Now, we're prolonging a situation, and it's not only Trump or Putin. They're doing exactly what their predecessors did in preparing for this and in preparing the weapons for it. It won't end with Trump either. There's too much profit on both sides in making these weapons.
Well, let me ask you about that. I mean, if you could argue that the beginning of the nuclear arms race was sort of fear-based or even ideologically based, and you developed these elaborate justifications for it, I honestly believe that now it's all about the contracts, that the ideological debate you have over this is really a thin veneer, giving some justification to what is basically a contractor-driven process, that there is so much money now involved in these weapons, about $50 billion a year the United States alone spends on it, that these contracts are driving the process forward.
Absolutely. We would be safer if we spent that money on anything else, or let's say, to avoid political insuperable obstacles to changing this, if we gave the money to Boeing and Northrop Grumman and Lockheed for not building weapons.
For not building weapons. Right. That's right. Can we just pay them protection money? Can we just say, look, we'll give you the money. Don't build the weapons. Don't bother
pay their
us.
workers and if preferably retrain their workers for building solar panels. I don't think that Boeing and Lockheed executives would think they'd make as much money out of solar panels. We would say, don't worry about that. You're going to get your subsidies that we've been giving you for the last 50 years, but don't endanger us by continuing this process of maintaining two doomsday machines on high alert with hair triggers that threatens all life on Earth.
Right.
There does have to be a way to buy off people who've been living on federal subsidy for the last over 70 years, essentially, in the aerospace industry.
So what about the moral issues? We began the discussion here about what you thought the initial war plans said about humankind, that we were capable of doing this. What's your view of the morality of nuclear weapons at all? Not just the plans you discussed, but a nuclear weapon.
Well, let me separate those two questions, because the first one should not is rarely singled out. Should a doomsday machine exist of the kind that we've actually had since 1950 under Harry Truman, but we didn't know it for another 30 years. Harry Truman in the Berlin crisis, with the 1,000 atomic warheads that he had, targeted by Curtis LeMay in charge of the Strategic Command, all entirely on cities, would have put smoke into the air, and we would not be here.
Right, and we didn't know that, but that's what
we
would have
didn't know
happened.
that for another 33 years.
Yeah.
And then it was contested because it was, it seemed to delegitimize our nuclear forces in a way that the Air Force didn't want to hear and nobody really wanted to hear. But it's been confirmed scientifically in the last 10 years. Nuclear winter, by the way, is something that many people think has been debunked or was a hoax, like various others. And that happens not to be true. It has been confirmed, as well as climate change has been confirmed. It's by the same models, climate models.
Right.
Okay, so we come back, even without nuclear winter. Let's go back to what I heard in 1961. Is an ability to kill 600 million people, or a billion, necessary for deterrence or anything else? Obviously not. Can it therefore be justified as a lesser evil of some kind, as a necessary evil? No, under no circumstances whatever. Actually launching that force, which we've come close to doing by false alarms in other hands, actually launching it could never, under any circumstances, be anything other than the greatest evil imaginable. Actually doing what we planned to do in the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we came very close to doing it, although neither leader wanted any conflict between the U.S. and Russia. That's what I've concluded from 50 years of studying that, having been participant in the Cuban Missile Crisis. I've become convinced that each was threatening armed operations against the other and preparing for it. Neither had any intention of wanting it, and yet non-nuclear, and yet came within a hair's breadth of actually blowing the world up. Could it be moral for either of them? And Russia had hardly anything at that time. Actually, they were bluffing. But for the Americans to have launched their force, as might have happened when I was in the Pentagon in October of 1962. And the answer is, it's not just immoral. We have no words for it. It would be the most evil act in the history of humanity.
Yeah, it's an act that would
end
be
ending our species. It would be self-destruction.
Okay, so that's that. Well, how about the use of one nuclear weapon?
Go to that.
Yes.
Because in between, if I may say,
okay.
First, there's no need to threaten that. The next question is, if it's immoral, which it obviously is, to carry out these acts, and really it would be immoral to leap ahead, to initiate attacks against anyone in terms of precedent and the proportionality, the terrible effects of starting an era in which nuclear wars did occur regularly. But in particular, think of carrying out the threats that Russia and the U.S. are still making against each other this year, Putin and Trump, of first use against each other, which would almost certainly escalate to full-scale use and the end of humanity. So using one of those weapons could be nothing other than the Doomsday Machine. But how about threatening it, which is what they're doing? Yes. Now, the bishops in 1983, in their pastoral letter, uttered a traditional church doctrine. It is forbidden to do what it is, forbidden to threaten what is forbidden to do. Yeah. If it's evil to do it, it's evil to threaten it. Most people feel that threatening it can be a lesser evil, even if it's considered an evil. Lesser, let's say, than being occupied now by the Nazis or by the Soviets. That's the operational morality of most people, that threatening such terrible action can be justified because if there's no alternative. Now, there really was always an alternative. It really was not necessary, but let's imagine that it was. Could it be moral was it moral to threaten to blow up the world, essentially? No. And that's true all the more now with the ending of the Cold War. The only force comparable to the Soviet Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union in the world today, the only one, is the U.S. With its carriers and its submarines and its superpower status. We're not threatened, and Russia and Europe is not threatened by anything comparable to what existed, let's say, in 1983, when the world almost blew up. I have misgivings about putting a total focus on the idea of getting rid of the possession of every nuclear weapon. The Pope has actually said, and he's showing great leadership on this issue and focus on it, he said that the possession of any nuclear weapon, thus the implicit threat, is morally condemnable.
Yes.
I don't think that will be accepted by the majority of conscientious, reflective people in the U.S. or Russia.
So you could imagine a situation where we get down to small numbers, but still
not sending them off. That really could never be rational or justifiable. But having the capability to respond in kind to, in some level, not necessarily on the same level, to some degree, to a nuclear attack is something that has always been part of the morality of the people of all the nuclear weapon states. And let's look at it for a minute. Was Russia, tyrannical as it was, like China still is, was it morally condemnable for acquiring a nuclear weapon, confronting the U.S., which otherwise would have a monopoly? Would the U.S. today be morally condemnable if it retained 10 or some nuclear weapons when Russia had hundreds, thousands, or even 10? And especially without verification of what they have. I don't think people can be induced to see that that's morally condemnable. I would hope they could be induced to see that there is no possible moral justification for what we have, and not for 50% of it, and not for 30% of it. Herbert York of Livermore Laboratory, the first director of it, said at one point that what was needed for deterrence against an enemy rational enough to be deterred in terms of survivable weapons was 1 or 10, or at the most, from another calculation, 100, but he said closer to 1 than 100.
Yes.
Well, let's say 50 or 49 or something.
Right, get down to a small
We now have
force.
1,500 on alert and about 4,000 operational weapons, plus about 4,000 on the shelf ready for dismantlement. The Russians about the same.
Yes.
10% of those weapons, 150 on each side, would still give you nuclear winter if they were sent. Thermonuclear weapons. So that's not a high enough, that's a good starting place for reduction, going down to roughly what the Chinese have in the way of intercontinental warfare.
And in getting down there,
go further.
You would also start to remove the profit motive. Let me close with your sort of view going forward. How optimistic or pessimistic are you that we're going to be able to find leaders and that we're going to have enough political pressure to reduce these nuclear forces, reduce the nuclear dangers?
I'm optimistic. I think we have a chance. I think it's not impossible. What is impossible in human society looking 10 years ahead? What was impossible in 1980 was that the Berlin Wall would be down in 1989. That was not unlikely. It was not very unlikely. It was impossible.
Yes.
There wasn't a person in the world who even imagined that as a serious matter by the end of 1980s. But it did happen. Gorbachev was essential to that, not he alone, but he was an essential process. We haven't had another Gorbachev in this country or Russia or anywhere else that I've seen. And looking back further, they don't come often, very often. But he did happen. It did occur. And it will take something, it will take a transformation of our values and our priorities and our political economy like that occurred in the USSR in the 90s, where the Soviet Union collapsed, the USSR collapsed, the Warsaw Pact dissolved, freeing resources which were not used well and got no help from us at all during that period, which they still rightfully resent from the U.S. There was a chance then, in other words, for Russia to become a peaceful ally of the United States, as some of them wanted to do.
Do you think
which was missed?
Do you think
could that happen again? Not in a year where the Democrats' main complaint about Trump is his naive talk about dealing with Putin and what might be the basis for that. Actually, that was the one aspect of his character, however it was based, whether it was bribery or blackmail or whatever, that I thought he did not want and does not want actually a Cold War. But in that, he's confronted not only by his own national security assistant, John Bolton, who does want not only a Cold War, but probably hot wars against Iran and North Korea. That's in his own administration. Who is opposing him in that respect? Backing him in wanting normal relations with Russia in the Democratic Party. I haven't seen it yet. And who is going to educate the American public on the need for that? I heard Jerry Brown talking about it just the other night at a Ploughshares event, courageously. I'm not sure he would have felt free to do that as governor, but now that he's out, he can say, we must not have a Cold War that prevents us from negotiating on nuclear matters and climate and other matters with Russia or with China or with North Korea or with Iran.
Yes.
None of, if you looked at the establishments in both parties, you would hardly find anyone advocating that. Jerry Brown is one of the very few. So it's obviously necessary and is no guarantee.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that human potentials are such and our experience is such that you can't say it's impossible. And if it's possible, which it is, it's worth a lifetime's work of effort to try to achieve it, to avert these nuclear dangers, to dismantle the doomsday machines, to keep oil in the ground. How likely is that? Well, it better not be impossible, because if it is, we're impossible.
Dan, thank you very much for spending all this time with us. It's been a real honor and a pleasure to be with you despite the subjects we've been discussing.
You don't find my optimism heartwarming? But it's what I live with, and it's enough for me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil and Megan McCall. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Research by Alex Spire. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit ploughshares.org.